Lemuel Lem Tilden's cabin, built inside the abandoned stone church, was mocked by his neighbors for its unconventional design. But when the harsh winter came, the cabin held a steady 58 degrees, defying all expectations and changing frontier architecture forever. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from, and if you're inspired by stories of ingenuity like this, hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow's episode is even more unbelievable than this one. Lemuel Lem Tilden stood outside his cabin, squinting into the swirling snow that had begun to coat the wilderness in a blanket of white. His breath puffed in the cold air, but he didn't feel it. He had built this cabin inside an old stone church, an unusual choice that had earned him the skepticism and mockery of his neighbors. The church, long abandoned, had stood as a silent monument to a time when settlers had hoped for a future in these harsh mountains. Now its roof was half collapsed, the windows broken, and the once pristine stone walls crumbling with age. Yet Lem saw potential in the structure that no one else did. He had spent months transforming the old, decaying building into a home. He had meticulously planned each detail, ensuring that the church's stone walls would provide insulation, keeping the cabin warmer than a traditional log cabin could ever be. But Lem knew that to his neighbors, he was just another fool wasting time in the wilderness. "They say he's building a tomb, not a cabin," chuckled Micah Jennings, one of Lem's closest neighbors, as he walked past the church with a few of his friends. The men's laughter echoed in the crisp air, their voices carrying far across the valley. They had all seen Lem working for weeks, laboring alone as the cold winter winds howled through the barren landscape. "He's wasting his winter on that monstrosity. What good is a house that nobody can live in?" Lem didn't answer, knowing better than to argue with the likes of Micah. The man had been in these mountains longer than Lem, and in Micah's eyes any break from tradition was a foolish risk. Most men in the area built their cabins quickly, often leaving gaps in the walls and roofs that would be patched up later. As long as the structure kept the wind out, it was good enough. But Lem wasn't like most men. He had a vision, one driven by the harsh realities of the mountain life he had chosen. He had seen too many cabins fall to the elements, too many homes succumb to the weight of snow or the force of a bear's claws. He knew his work would have to withstand more than the cold. It would have to be strong enough to resist whatever the wilds could throw at it. Lem took a moment to look at the structure he had built, a sturdy log cabin inside the stone walls of the church. The logs were carefully placed, each one stripped of bark and measured to fit perfectly. He had used a method of construction learned from the sturdiest frontier cabins: pinned corners, iron nails, and wood chinking made from clay, horsehair, and pine resin. The windows were small, high on the walls, and reinforced with thick wood. The door was a masterpiece in itself, a heavy slab of wood bound together with iron brackets, designed to withstand any attempt to break through. He knew the risks he was taking by building inside the church, but Lem didn't fear failure. He had always believed in the power of innovation. As he stood there, Micah and his friends disappeared into the snowstorm, their laughter still echoing in the distance. Lem didn't mind. He knew what he was doing wasn't about impressing anyone. It was about survival. This winter, Lem planned to prove that his vision for a better cabin could withstand anything the wilds could throw at him. Even if no one else believed it, he knew he was on the right path. The cold wind howled louder now, the storm picking up as the sun dipped behind the mountains. Lem turned back to his cabin, the warmth from the fire inside calling to him. He had a long winter ahead, and he would be ready. The first snowstorm of the season hit hard that October, creeping up from the mountains like a shadow, and by the end of the day, Lem's cabin was buried beneath a thick blanket of white. The wind howled through the valley, cutting through the trees and whipping the snow into a blinding haze. Lem could hear the wind's mournful wail as he worked, but inside his cabin it was warm and quiet. The stone walls absorbed the heat from the fire, and the logs he had carefully fitted into place sealed out the cold. Despite the growing storm outside, Lem felt a sense of peace as he sat by the fire, his thoughts consumed by the cabin he had built. It had taken him months of work, weeks spent cutting and hauling logs, days spent meticulously fitting each one into place. The chinking between the logs was a mixture of clay, horsehair, and pine resin designed to keep out both the cold and the drafts. As he sat by the fire, he couldn't help but think about the winter ahead. He knew the snow would come, the temperatures would drop, and the winds would howl. But he also knew that his cabin would be ready. Unlike the hastily constructed homes of his neighbors, his cabin had been built with every detail in mind, made to endure the worst that the wilderness could offer. The storm outside grew fiercer as the evening wore on, but Lem wasn't worried. He had spent countless nights out here, and each time he had learned more about the land and its ways. His cabin wasn't just a shelter, it was his survival strategy. It was an investment in his future, a solid foundation that would keep him safe when everything else failed. The abandoned church had seemed like an odd place to build at first, but Lem had seen its potential from the start. Its stone walls would act as a barrier against the cold winds that swept through the valley. He wasn't building just for today. He was building for the long haul. As Lem stoked the fire, he thought about the people who lived nearby. His neighbors had already started to hunker down for the winter. They would spend the coming weeks preparing food, gathering firewood, and checking their cabins. But Lem knew that they didn't understand what he had done. His decision to build inside the church had been met with mockery. They didn't see the future the way he did. The men of the valley were practical, building fast, and focusing on the immediate need. But Lem's focus was on the long term. His cabin was meant to withstand more than just the first few weeks of winter. It was meant to survive the months that followed, when the storms became relentless and the temperatures plummeted to bone-chilling lows. The wind screamed against the cabin's stone walls, but Lem's thoughts were calm. The warmth of the fire wrapped around him like a protective blanket, and for the first time since he began the project, Lem allowed himself to relax. He knew that no matter what came, his cabin would be ready, and when the snow stopped falling, he would step out into the world outside, knowing that he had built something that would last. Lem's hands were raw from weeks of hard labor, but he didn't stop. He couldn't. The winter was coming, and there was work to be done. The cabin had to be finished, and he had a plan. Every part of the cabin had a purpose, from the stone foundation to the carefully crafted roof. Lem had built it from necessity. There was no time for mistakes. Every detail, from the chinking to the reinforced door, had been designed to withstand the harshest conditions. The stone walls of the church provided an unexpected strength, but it was the logs Lem had chosen that gave the cabin its sturdiness. He had spent days felling trees in the forest, selecting only the straightest, strongest logs. Each log had to be just right, with no signs of rot or warping. He used a draw knife to strip the bark from each log, carefully smoothing the surface before fitting it into place. The process was slow, but it was necessary. The logs had to fit together perfectly to create a structure that would stand strong against the wild elements. The hardest part of the project, however, was the chinking. Most men in the area used mud and moss, a quick solution that didn't last. But Lem had a different idea. He had learned about a mixture of clay, horsehair, and pine resin from a trapper he had met years ago, a trapper who swore by its durability. It was a labor-intensive process, but Lem was willing to put in the work. He spent days preparing the mixture, boiling the pine resin until it was thick and sticky, then mixing it with the clay and horsehair. Once the mixture was ready, he packed it tightly between the logs, ensuring that no air or moisture could seep through. As he worked, Lem thought about his neighbors again. He could almost hear their voices mocking him, questioning his methods. But he had learned long ago that people would always question what they didn't understand. They couldn't see the value in the work he was doing. They couldn't understand that he was building not just for himself, but for the future. The way most men built their cabins was good enough for short-term survival. But Lem wasn't thinking about the short term. He was thinking about long winters spent alone in the wilderness, nights when the temperature would drop so low that even the sturdiest cabins would be pushed to their limits. He wanted a home that would keep him warm, no matter the conditions. The stone church had given him a solid foundation, but it was the extra care Lem had taken in every aspect of the cabin that made it unique. The roof, reinforced with layers of pine bark, clay, and sod, would keep out the snow and rain. The door, crafted from thick planks of wood, was a work of art. He had used iron brackets to secure it, making sure that no bear or person could force their way in. Lem had thought of everything, and as he stepped back to admire his work, he felt a sense of pride. The cabin wasn't just a shelter, it was a testament to his determination, and no matter how many men doubted him, he knew that his work would stand the test of time. The first heavy snowfall of the season came in early November, blanketing the land in a thick coat of white. Lem watched from the warmth of his cabin as the storm raged outside. He had finished his work and was satisfied, but he couldn't ignore the voices of his neighbors. Most of the men in the valley had already settled into their homes, their cabins hastily constructed and prepared for the cold. Yet Lem knew that what he had built was different. His cabin, crafted inside the walls of an abandoned stone church, was unlike anything anyone else had built. As Lem shoveled snow off the porch, Bart Granger appeared in the distance, making his way toward the cabin. The tall, broad-shouldered trapper had a look of concern on his face. Bart had been Lem's friend for years, but like everyone else, he was skeptical of the cabin. "You sure about this, Lem?" Bart asked, pausing at the doorstep. "This is a lot of work for something that might not even hold up in the winter." Lem nodded, not bothered by the question. "I'm sure, Bart. It's built to last." Bart squinted at the walls of the cabin, his eyes tracing the stone foundation that surrounded the logs. "It looks strong, but that's a lot of weight. You think those old walls are going to hold when the snow piles up? And what if a bear comes?" Lem had heard the concerns before. Most of the valley men had raised similar doubts, all questioning the stability of his unconventional structure. They didn't understand his reasoning, nor did they see the value in the painstaking detail he had put into every part of the cabin. But Lem didn't mind their doubts. He knew what he was doing. His cabin wasn't just a shelter, it was an answer to the challenges of survival in the mountains. He could hear the mocking laughter of Micah and the other men in the valley as they trudged through the snow to their own homes. Lem had heard their taunts, their disbelief in the new design, but his focus remained unshaken. This cabin wasn't about impressing anyone. It was about survival, about making it through the long, brutal winters that could break a man if he wasn't prepared. Bart stepped inside the cabin, the warmth immediately evident as he removed his snow-covered boots. "I'll admit, Lem," he said, "you've done a lot more than I expected. The fire's already keeping the place warm." Lem smiled, a quiet satisfaction filling him. "It's more than just the fire. The stone walls help keep the heat in. And the way I've sealed everything, it's designed to hold the warmth even through the coldest nights." Bart looked around, nodding slowly. "Well, I'll be damned. Looks like you might have something here after all." But even as Bart seemed to soften, Lem knew the true test had yet to come. The valley was filled with doubters, and the winter would reveal if Lem's work had truly been worth it. Still, as the storm continued outside, Lem couldn't help but feel a quiet confidence. The cabin was ready. Lem awoke to the sound of wind howling outside, the storm having intensified overnight. Snow piled up against the cabin's stone walls, and the temperature had dropped below freezing. He rose early, stoking the fire in the hearth before stepping outside. The cold hit him immediately, but as he glanced back at his cabin, he felt a deep sense of pride. The place he had spent months building was now his refuge, ready to face whatever the season could bring. The storm had turned the landscape into a stark white wilderness. Trees were bent low under the weight of the snow, and the valley was quiet, save for the sound of the wind whipping through the pines. Lem took a deep breath, the crisp air filling his lungs. The cold didn't bother him. The cabin, with its thick stone walls and carefully crafted logs, was holding up perfectly. Inside, the warmth from the fire spread evenly through the room. The cabin was far more comfortable than most of the other homes in the valley, which were still drafty despite the efforts of their builders. Lem had no intention of following the usual method of building. He had taken the time to ensure that his cabin would keep the cold out completely. The clay, horsehair, and pine resin chinking he had carefully packed between the logs had already begun to prove its worth. The temperature inside the cabin held steady, far warmer than anything outside. Later that morning, Lem heard a series of knocks at the door. When he opened it, he found Bart standing there, his face flushed from the cold. "I had to see it for myself," Bart said, stepping inside. "It's a damn sight warmer in here than my cabin." Lem nodded. "Told you it would be." Bart didn't seem surprised, but there was a new respect in his eyes. He had been skeptical of Lem's methods from the start, but now he was starting to understand the care and attention that had gone into every detail of the cabin. The stone walls, combined with the precision of the log placement, had made all the difference. "Looks like you might have figured something out after all," Bart admitted, brushing snow from his coat. Lem gave a quiet smile. "It's about building for the long term. Anyone can throw a cabin up quickly, but when the storms come and the cold sets in, you need more than that." Bart leaned against the wall, taking in the warmth of the fire. "I'll be damned if you didn't make it work. Guess I'll have to rethink how I build my next cabin." Lem simply nodded. As the storm raged outside, he knew that the coming winter would be a true test of his cabin's resilience. But for now, he had made it through the first night, and that was something he could be proud of. By late November, Lem had grown accustomed to the solitude of his cabin. The early winter storms had come and gone, but the temperature remained frigid, dipping well below freezing each night. Lem had spent his days checking traps, making sure his provisions were stocked and fortifying his cabin. Yet, even as he went about his routine, he couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. It was late one evening, as he sat by the fire, that he first heard it, a low, rumbling growl just outside the cabin. Lem froze, his hand instinctively reaching for the rifle propped beside the hearth. He was no stranger to bears, but this one felt different. The growl came again, louder this time, as if the creature was circling the cabin, testing its defenses. Lem stood slowly, listening intently, as the bear's claws scraped against the stone walls. The wind howled outside, but the growl of the bear seemed louder than the storm. Lem had seen enough to know when a bear was testing its boundaries. Most men would have fired a shot to scare it off, but Lem had learned that a bear that was determined would only come back more viciously. Instead, he stood still, holding his breath and watching through the narrow slit of his gun port, a small opening he had designed into the cabin for moments like this. The bear paced around the cabin, sniffing the air, its massive form shifting in and out of view. Lem's heart pounded in his chest, but he kept his movements slow and deliberate, not wanting to startle the animal. The last thing he needed was a bear ramming itself through the door. He had built his cabin with the utmost care, but even his meticulous craftsmanship couldn't guarantee that it would withstand a determined grizzly. Minutes stretched on like hours. Lem could feel the pressure mounting as the bear moved around the perimeter of the cabin, testing the windows, the door, and the corners. Each scrape of its claws sent a shiver through him. The bear was relentless, clearly intent on finding a way inside. Lem's fingers tightened on the rifle, ready to fire if necessary, but he held back, waiting for the right moment. He had no intention of killing the bear unless he absolutely had to. The wilderness was a delicate balance, and he respected its creatures, yet his own survival depended on keeping them out of his home. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the bear gave up. It circled the cabin one last time, sniffing the air one more time before it turned and lumbered off into the night. Lem let out a long breath and lowered the rifle. The bear had tested his cabin, and it had failed to find any weaknesses. Lem stood there for a moment, still listening to the distant echoes of the bears' retreat. His cabin had held strong, its stone walls and reinforced structure proving that they could stand against the wilderness. It was a small victory, but it was enough. The night had proven that his work had been worth it, and he smiled quietly to himself, knowing that he had built something that could withstand the harshest challenges the wild could throw at him. The first few weeks of winter passed in a haze of cold winds and heavy snow. Lem kept to his routine, making the long trek to check his traps and maintaining his cabin. Each day the wilderness outside his cabin seemed more brutal, more unforgiving. Yet, every evening, he returned to the warmth of his fire, grateful for the shelter he had built. One morning, after a particularly harsh storm, Lem returned to his cabin to find a set of fresh tracks near the door. The footprints were deep in the snow, suggesting a heavy man had walked by recently. He paused, his hand instinctively resting on the rifle slung over his shoulder. No one else lived within miles, but Lem had learned to be cautious in the wilderness. Strangers could be as dangerous as any wild animal. But when he opened the door, he found Bart Granger standing on his doorstep, a small pack slung over his shoulder. Bart's usually weathered face was now set in a more serious expression than Lem had ever seen. "Figured I'd stop by and see for myself," Bart said, stepping inside when Lem motioned for him to. Lem didn't ask what brought Bart out in such a storm. Bart had always been a man of few words. The two of them had known each other for years, but it was clear that something had changed. For once, Bart wasn't laughing or teasing. His eyes scanned the interior of the cabin with the kind of quiet respect that Lem had earned only through months of work. Bart removed his snow-covered coat and hung it near the fire. "I've been hearing things," he said after a long pause, finally meeting Lem's eyes. "About your cabin." Lem raised an eyebrow, but he didn't speak. He had expected this. He knew his cabin had become a topic of conversation in the valley ever since its completion. He didn't mind the talk. The proof would come when winter truly set in. Bart continued, "Folks are saying it's something else, how warm it stays in here, how it holds up against the cold. Even Micah's saying you might have figured something out." Lem kept his expression neutral. Micah had mocked his cabin from the start, calling it foolish and impractical. To hear that he was admitting it had any merit was a surprise. "I heard a few men talking last week," Bart went on. "Said they were going to try and build their own cabins like yours next year. They think your method might be the way to go." Lem nodded. The thought didn't surprise him. The one thing that the mountain men respected more than anything was survival. The harsh winter, combined with Lem's success, had begun to change their minds. "I never wanted to be right about this," Lem said quietly, staring into the fire. "I just wanted to make sure I could survive." Bart smiled. "Well, it looks like you've got that part figured out." Outside, the wind picked up again, howling across the valley. Inside, the warmth of the fire flickered as the two men sat in silence. Lem didn't need any more recognition. The fact that word was spreading was enough. His work had proven itself. Lem had been sitting by the fire quietly reflecting on the change in his neighbors' attitudes when Bart returned the following day. The storm had passed, but the cold remained, biting at the bones. Bart's face was more weathered than usual, a sign that the winter had already started to take its toll, even on the experienced trappers and settlers. He stepped inside without a word, his boots heavy with snow. His eyes scanned the cabin once more, lingering on the stone walls, the carefully fitted logs, and the fire that still burned warm in the hearth. He seemed to take in every detail this time, not with skepticism, but with genuine curiosity. Lem set aside his pipe and stood. "What brings you back, Bart?" Bart didn't answer immediately. Instead, he shrugged off his coat and warmed his hands by the fire. "I've been thinking about what you said before," he began, his voice quieter than usual, "about building for the long haul. I didn't see it at first, but now, well, it's clear you weren't just building to survive one winter." Lem nodded. He had said it before, but seeing Bart's shift in perspective felt like a small victory. Takes more than a quick cabin to survive out here. Winter's just the start of it. It's the long nights, the bears, the cold winds that'll break a man. Bart took a seat near the fire, looking down at his hands. I've spent most of my life out here, Lem, and I always thought quick and simple was good enough. But after hearing about how your cabin held up against the storms and seeing it for myself, I gotta admit you've built something different. He paused, his tone changing slightly. My cabin's already cold in places. The wind cuts through the walls even when the fire's roaring. I've seen the difference between what you've done and what we all usually do, and damn it, it's making me rethink everything. Lem didn't boast. He simply looked at Bart, letting the silence speak for him. He'd always known that the work he'd put into his cabin would eventually speak louder than any words of defense or pride. And now, Bart was seeing it for himself. "Think I could make something like this?" Bart asked, his gaze flicking to the door. "You think it's too late to start something this late in the season?" Lem considered the question. "You could, but it'd take time, a lot of it. The weather's not going to make it easy. But if you're willing to learn, I can show you how I did it. It's more than just the logs and stone, though. It's about knowing the land, knowing how it works, and using that to your advantage." Bart looked away for a moment, his eyes narrowing as if deep in thought. Finally he spoke. "I've got the time, and if it means getting through the next winter better than I have before, I'm willing to put in the work." Lem nodded again, knowing Bart's words were the beginning of something larger. The work would be tough, but it would be worth it. And now Lem wasn't alone in his belief. Winter seemed to stretch on endlessly, the snow falling in thick, heavy layers each day, and Lem continued his routine. The forest provided for his traps, the fires in his cabin kept him warm, and the food stores he'd carefully packed were holding out better than he'd expected. But with each passing storm, Lem's thoughts drifted more often to the church. Its walls, once crumbling and forgotten, had now become his sanctuary. The stone foundation that had once been abandoned and left to decay had become the stronghold of his survival. One evening, as Lem stood at the window, looking out at the snow-covered landscape, he reflected on how strange it was that this church, this relic of a time long past, had become the key to his survival. The church had once symbolized hope for the settlers who had passed through the area, and now its walls were sheltering him. It wasn't just the church that had made the cabin work, though. It was the way Lem had adapted it to meet his needs. He hadn't just rebuilt the church into a cabin. He had rebuilt it into something that worked for the land, something that could withstand the harshest winters. In a strange way, the church's legacy had become his own. The men of the valley, who had once mocked him, were now beginning to see the value in his methods. Bart had been the first to openly admit that he might need to adopt some of Lem's techniques, and Lem had no doubt others would follow suit. But that wasn't why Lem had built the cabin. He hadn't built it to impress anyone. He had built it to survive, and in doing so, he had found his own way forward. The stone walls provided a foundation of stability. The thick logs, painstakingly selected and shaped, created a shelter strong enough to withstand anything the winter could throw at it. And the chinking, the mixture of clay, horsehair, and pine resin, had sealed the cabin in a way that allowed Lem to maintain a comfortable temperature inside, no matter how brutal the storm outside. The church's legacy, in a way, had passed into Lem's hands. And it wasn't just the physical structure that he had inherited. It was the idea of shelter, of survival, of making something stronger out of the pieces left behind. The settlers who had abandoned the church had left behind more than just stone walls. They had left a lesson in resilience, one that Lem had taken to heart. As Lem prepared for another night in his warm cabin, he glanced once more at the stone walls. The church had once been a symbol of hope. Now it was a symbol of the strength that came from making something new out of the old. And Lem knew, as the wind howled outside, that he had built something that would last. December arrived, and the storm clouds gathered like an army on the horizon. The air grew sharp with biting cold, and the snow began to fall relentlessly, blanketing the world outside in a thick, unbroken layer of white. Lem stood at the door of his cabin, looking out over the valley. The mountains were nearly invisible, hidden by the swirling flurries. The wind howled through the trees, but inside, the warmth of the fire in the hearth wrapped around him like a shield. Lem had known this was coming. The harshest part of winter was always the last stretch, when the storms came hard and often. But his cabin was ready. The stone walls, reinforced with logs, held the heat inside, and the clay horsehair chinking was holding firm. He had spent weeks preparing, stocking up on firewood, checking his traps, and ensuring that the cabin would hold strong through the worst of it. And as the wind picked up, rattling the doorframe, Lem felt a quiet confidence. His cabin had already weathered several storms, and it would weather many more. Over the next few days, the storm intensified. The temperature plummeted to dangerous lows, and the wind tore through the valley like a beast. The snow piled higher, and the pressure outside was immense. Lem stayed inside the cabin, working by the fire, carefully preparing his supplies and maintaining the cabin. Each day was more of the same, stoking the fire, checking for leaks, and making sure his provisions were sufficient. But Lem was beginning to realize that it wasn't just the cold that tested him. It was the isolation. Even though the cabin was warm and secure, the absence of human company was starting to weigh on him. He didn't mind the solitude, not really. But there were moments when the silence became overwhelming. When the wind roared outside, it felt like the world was closing in. Lem had been alone in these mountains for years, but the harshness of this winter made him long for the company of other men, even if just for a few hours. But the valley was still silent, save for the occasional traveler who had passed through weeks ago before the worst of the storms hit. On the fourth day of the storm, Lem heard the familiar sound of boots crunching through the snow. His heart skipped a beat. No one had come to visit in weeks, and with the storm so fierce it was a rare thing indeed. He grabbed his rifle and moved quietly to the door, peeking out through the gun port. It was Bart, his face flushed from the cold, his coat heavy with snow. "I couldn't stay inside any longer," Bart said as Lem opened the door. "Figured I'd come check on you." Lem smiled and stepped aside, letting Bart in. The warmth from the fire hit Bart immediately, and he sighed in relief. "Damn, this place is like a furnace," Bart said, shaking off the snow. "Couldn't have made it through without it," Lem replied, settling back into his chair by the fire. Bart looked around, his eyes sweeping the cabin. "I'm starting to think you've got something here after all." Lem said nothing, letting the quiet of the cabin speak for itself. The storm raged on outside, but inside it was warm, warm enough for two men to sit and share a meal. And for a brief moment, the isolation of winter didn't feel so harsh. By early January, the storm had subsided, but the cold still held the valley in a vice. The snow remained thick on the ground, untouched by sunlight. Lem had been alone for the better part of the season, with only Bart stopping by to visit. But that day, as Lem sat by the fire, he heard the distinct sound of someone knocking on his door. It was a soft, tentative knock, unlike the usual loud raps of a traveler seeking shelter. Lem stood up slowly, wondering who would be outside in such terrible weather. When he opened the door, he found two men standing there, both covered in snow and shivering from the cold. One was a younger man, no older than 20, with a ruddy face and wide eyes. The other was older, perhaps in his 40s, his face weathered and grizzled from years spent in the mountains. "Can we come in?" the younger man asked, his voice shaking. "We've been walking for hours and we're lost." Lem didn't hesitate. He stepped aside to let them in. "You've come to the right place," he said as they entered. Both men looked exhausted, their faces pale from the cold. "Come in, sit by the fire." They gratefully collapsed into the chairs near the hearth, letting the warmth of the fire soak into their frozen bones. Lem took a moment to study them, They were both poorly dressed for the weather, with thin coats and worn boots. It was clear they had been out in the snow much longer than they realized. "My name's Nathan," the younger man said, his teeth chattering. "This is my brother Abel. We got separated from our group. We don't know how we ended up here." Lem nodded, still eyeing their clothes. They were fortunate to have found his cabin. Without proper shelter, they would have been at the mercy of the cold. Abel, the older man, looked at Lem gratefully. "We don't mean to impose," he said, "but we didn't think we'd make it much longer." Lem shrugged. "No one survives out here alone for long, but you're safe now." He quickly prepared a small meal for the men, offering them warm stew and a cup of tea. As they ate, they told Lem their story. They had been part of a larger group of settlers heading west, but had gotten lost during the storm. Their guide had gone missing days ago, and they had been wandering the wilderness without a clear direction. Lem listened quietly, recognizing the desperation in their voices. They weren't the first to get lost in these mountains, and they wouldn't be the last. But they had found shelter when they needed it most, and Lem was content knowing that his cabin had proven itself once again. As the storm outside continued to rage, Lem sat back in his chair, feeling the satisfaction of knowing that his hard work had not only kept him alive, but had given others a chance at survival as well. The cabin had become more than just a shelter. It had become a symbol of safety in an unforgiving world. The storm that had battered the valley for weeks finally began to subside, but Lem knew that the hardest part of winter was still ahead. The snow piled high outside, and the temperature remained dangerously low, dipping further every night. The isolation of the mountains grew more oppressive with each passing day, but Lem's cabin stood firm. The warmth from the fire kept the interior comfortable, and the stone walls held their strength. Inside it was always 58 degrees, no matter how fierce the storm outside. Lem had seen the storm's toll on the valley. Men who had built their homes quickly were now struggling to keep their fires burning. The wind howled through the cracks in their walls, and the temperature inside their cabins dropped each night. Some of the men had already come to him, asking for advice on how to reinforce their homes. Others, still skeptical, scoffed at the idea of spending so much time on something that wasn't immediately necessary. But Lem knew better. He had built his cabin for the long term, and the first major storm of the season was just a hint of what was to come. As the snow continued to fall outside, Lem sat by the fire, sharpening his axe and thinking about the future. The work he had put into his cabin had paid off, but it wasn't just about surviving one winter. It was about preparing for every winter, every storm, every obstacle the wilderness could throw at him. He'd learned from the best and the worst, adapting techniques to suit the harsh conditions of the mountains. The church's stone walls had provided a solid foundation, but it was the small details, how he'd carefully selected the logs, the clay and horsehair chinking, the reinforced door that made the cabin truly secure. But it wasn't just the construction that had gotten Lem through. It was his mindset. He had learned to endure, to survive the brutal cold and isolation. He'd learned to listen to the wilderness and adapt to its rhythms. As the days passed, Lem found solace in the routine, checking his traps, maintaining the cabin, and keeping a close watch on the weather kept him grounded. He had no intention of abandoning the mountains anytime soon. It was on the 23rd day of the storm that Lem realized just how well his cabin had been designed. He had spent all day outside, shoveling the walkway and checking the snow levels around the cabin's perimeter. Despite the constant battering from the wind, the cabin had held strong. The stone walls had kept the cold at bay, and the fire inside had kept him warm and comfortable. He smiled to himself, knowing that his hard work had not only provided for his needs, but had given him peace of mind. As the storm finally began to ease, Lem sat back and allowed himself a rare moment of satisfaction. He had weathered the worst the wilderness could throw at him. His cabin had proven itself, And in the quiet of the mountains, Lem knew he had found the kind of security and strength that would last for years to come. By late January, the storm had abated, leaving behind a winter landscape that was both serene and unforgiving. The snow had settled, creating a thick layer on the ground, and the cold remained a constant presence. Lem had grown used to the quiet isolation, but he knew he wasn't alone in the mountains. He had heard from his neighbors about the challenges they were facing. It seemed that despite all their preparation, the relentless storms had taken their toll. Bart had stopped by the previous week, looking worn and anxious. Lem could tell that something was bothering him, but his friend had never been one to easily open up. It wasn't until the morning of January 28th that Lem understood why. The knock on the door was urgent, the sound of boots crunching in the snow quick and heavy. Lem opened it to find Bart standing there, his face pale and his breath coming in shallow gasps. "Lem," Bart said, his voice tight with stress, "I need help. My cabin. It's gone. The roof collapsed last night." Lem's heart sank. He had been concerned about the weight of the snow on Bart's cabin, but he hadn't expected the damage to be this bad. He quickly grabbed his coat and rifle, motioning for Bart to follow him. The two men trudged through the deep snow, making their way toward Bart's homestead. When they arrived, Lem could see the damage immediately. The roof of Bart's cabin had caved in under the weight of the snow, and the walls had buckled in several places. It was a total loss. The door was completely blocked by debris, and the interior was buried beneath a heap of snow and collapsed wood. "God damn it," Bart muttered, shaking his head. "I thought I could get through it. I really did." Lem knew the feeling. He had seen too many cabins fall to the weight of the winter storms. Most of the valley's cabins were built quickly, with little regard for the long-term durability required to withstand the harsh conditions. "You've got to build to last, Bart," Lem said quietly, kneeling to examine the wreckage. "It's not just about getting through one season. It's about building something that can hold up year after year." Bart stared at the ruins of his cabin, his shoulders slumped. "I know. I should have done something more. Now look at it." Lem gave him a sympathetic look, but said nothing more. Instead, he began working with Bart to clear the snow and salvage what they could. It wasn't the first time Lem had been asked to help rebuild, and it wouldn't be the last. But as they worked together, Lem knew that this was another opportunity to show Bart the value of a solid foundation. And it was a reminder to Lem that even the best-built cabins could collapse under the weight of a harsh winter, but the key was learning from mistakes and making something better the next time around. The wind picked up again at the end of February, signaling the arrival of another storm. Lem had grown used to the rhythm of the seasons, each winter followed by a spring that seemed to take forever to arrive. The snow piled higher each day, and the cold became more oppressive as the wind swept across the valley. Lem's cabin stood firm, its stone walls holding fast against the storm. The fire inside kept him warm, but he knew the worst was still to come. The storm raged for 3 days, its fury shaking the trees and bending the landscape into an icy blur. Lem spent the first day inside, checking the cabin for any weaknesses. The chinking between the logs held tight, the stone foundation held steady, and the roof, reinforced with layers of pine bark and clay, showed no signs of damage. The temperature outside plummeted to well below freezing, but inside the fire kept the cabin at a comfortable 58 degrees. Lem had designed it this way, and he could feel the satisfaction of knowing his work had paid off. By the second day of the storm, Lem felt the isolation weighing on him. He hadn't seen another soul in weeks, and the howling winds outside reminded him of how vulnerable he was in this wilderness. But he knew there was no other way to survive. The mountains had always been unforgiving, and the winter would not let up until spring arrived. It was a test of endurance, and Lem had prepared himself for it. As the storm continued, Lem spent his days checking his traps and ensuring that his firewood supply was ample. He knew that the more he could prepare now, the easier the next few months would be. Even though his cabin had held strong against the elements, the land was still a constant challenge. The storms might pass, but the cold would linger. Lem had learned that survival wasn't just about facing one challenge, it was about facing them all, one after another. Even in the face of this harsh winter, he remained determined, a quiet resolve settling over him. By the third day, the storm showed no signs of easing. Lem sat by the fire, his eyes heavy with exhaustion, but his thoughts were focused. He had faced the worst of it before. Storms like this had come and gone. But this time, he wasn't just surviving. His cabin had proven itself. And that was a victory in itself. As the snow continued to fall outside, Lem leaned back in his chair, allowing himself a rare moment of peace. He knew there was more to come, but for now, the storm outside didn't seem so threatening. His cabin, built with care and ingenuity, had kept him safe. The land could test him all it wanted, but Lem was ready for whatever came next. He had built something that would withstand the worst, and he was ready to face whatever nature threw at him, knowing he had the strength and the tools to endure. When the storm finally passed, the valley was left in a stunned silence. The air was still cold, but the winds had calmed and the snow began to settle. Lem stood outside his cabin, surveying the landscape. The trees were weighed down with thick layers of snow, and the ground was buried beneath a blanket of white. The storm had taken its toll on the valley, but Lem's cabin had held strong. His heart swelled with quiet pride. He had built it to endure, and now, after the storm, it stood as a testament to his perseverance. He checked his firewood supply, making sure it hadn't been depleted during the storm, and then turned to inspect the cabin's exterior. The stone foundation was still intact, and the roof had withstood the snow without issue. Lem's careful planning had paid off. There were no leaks, no gaps, no signs of weakness in the structure. His cabin was a testament to the work he had put into it, and now, after the worst storm of the season, it was more than just a shelter. It was a refuge, a place where he could rest and recover from the harsh conditions outside. His determination had proved itself, and the cabin stood strong, unyielding against nature's fury. As Lem worked, he thought about the other cabins in the valley. He knew that many of them had suffered during the storm. The men who had built their homes quickly were now struggling to keep their fires burning. The wind howled through the cracks in their walls, and the temperature inside their cabins dropped each night. The harsh truth was that many of them hadn't built with the long term in mind. They had built to survive the immediate winter, but they hadn't considered what would happen when the storms came. Lem understood that, unlike the others, his work had laid the foundation for survival long after the storm had passed. When Lem made his rounds through the valley to check on his neighbors, he saw the damage firsthand. Bart's cabin had taken another hit. The roof partially collapsed under the weight of the snow. Micah's cabin had held up better, but the cold had crept inside, and the firewood supply had dwindled faster than he had expected. Some men seemed to be coping better than others, but none had the certainty that Lem felt inside his cabin. Lem didn't offer advice immediately. He knew that the other men were too proud to accept it, but as he walked through the snow back to his cabin, he realized that word would spread about his success. He wasn't trying to prove anything to anyone. He had simply built what he needed to survive. But the evidence was clear now. His cabin had withstood the worst winter storm the valley had seen in years, and his neighbors would have to recognize that. Lem's resolve had paid off. When Lem returned to the warmth of his cabin, he sat by the fire and let the quiet settle over him. It had been a long, hard winter, but he had made it through. And in that moment, Lem understood that survival wasn't about the storm itself. It was about how well you could endure when the storm had passed. It was about knowing that no matter what came, his cabin would remain, and that was enough. Spring arrived slowly, as it always did in the mountains. The snow melted at a steady pace, revealing the bare earth beneath, but the valley was still a long way from thawing. Lem's cabin, however, stood strong and weathered. a beacon of resilience in the landscape. The quiet of winter had given way to a new kind of silence, the kind that only followed a long period of hardship. Lem had become accustomed to the solitude, but now the valley seemed to be waking up from its long slumber. Bart had visited more frequently, checking on Lem's progress and learning the finer points of cabin construction. Their talks had become more than just about logs and stone. They discussed the things that mattered most: survival, longevity, and how one man's vision could change an entire way of thinking. Word had spread throughout the valley about the success of Lem's cabin. The men who had once mocked him were now seeking his advice, asking him how he had managed to withstand the brutal storms with minimal damage. As Lem worked on his cabin, patching up small sections that had been tested by the storms, he saw more and more men coming to him. Some were hesitant, unsure of where to begin. Others were eager, ready to dive into the hard work required to build something lasting. Lem didn't mind the attention. He had built the cabin to survive, not for recognition. But as the weeks passed, he saw the change in his neighbors' faces, the realization that survival wasn't just about getting through the next storm. It was about building something that would last through all of them. Micah was the first to approach him, a wary look in his eyes. "I've been thinking," he began, "about what you said last winter, about building for the long term." He paused, looking down at his boots. "I think I might try it, Lem. I might try building something better, something that'll hold up next time." Lem nodded, but he didn't respond right away. He could see the sincerity in Micah's eyes, the willingness to learn. That was all Lem had ever wanted, to show his neighbors that taking the time to build carefully was worth it in the end. "I'll show you what I know," Lem said simply. Over the next few months, more men came to him, each asking for advice, each ready to work. The valley had slowly started to change. What had once been a community of men focused only on the immediate challenges of surviving the winter had now become a community focused on long-term survival, learning from Lem's example. The men who had once mocked Lem's cabin were now the ones asking him how to build their own. The old ways of throwing together cabins with little thought to the future were beginning to fade. Lem had shown them that survival wasn't just about facing immediate threats. It was about being prepared for anything that could come, and building for the long haul. By summer, Lem had built his cabin into something more than just a home. It had become a symbol, a testament to the idea that good construction could stand the test of time. As the valley recovered from the winter, the men who had once scoffed at Lem's methods now spoke of his cabin with respect. It had withstood the harshest storms, and the work that Lem had put into it had proven its worth. Lem had never set out to be a pioneer or an innovator. He had built the cabin to survive, nothing more. But now, as he watched his neighbors begin to adopt his techniques, he saw that his small act of survival had turned into something far greater than he had expected. The men who had learned from him were now building cabins that could withstand whatever the wilderness could throw at them. They came to him with questions, and he was happy to help, teaching them how to select the right logs, how to chink with clay and pine resin, and how to reinforce their doors and windows. They were learning that survival wasn't just about surviving the next winter, but preparing for many winters to come. In the months that followed, more and more settlers began to arrive in the valley, drawn by the stories of Lem's cabin and the changes in the community. They had heard of the new methods, the careful construction, and the resilience of Lem's design. Some of them sought him out for advice, while others simply admired the cabins being built in the valley. The word had spread far beyond the mountains, and Lem knew that his work had influenced not just his neighbors, but others who had yet to arrive. As the town expanded, Lem's ideas became the foundation of their community, literally and figuratively. But Lem was content with the quiet life he had built. He had no desire for fame or recognition. What mattered most to him was the knowledge that he had built something that had lasting value. The legacy of his cabin and the methods he had pioneered would live on in the valley long after he was gone. He had shown his neighbors that survival was not just about enduring the seasons, it was about building something that could withstand them all. And in that, Lem had found his true purpose. As the valley flourished and more men adopted Lem's methods, the idea of long-term survival became a cornerstone of the community's philosophy. The days of hasty construction and quick fixes were behind them. The valley had changed, and Lem had been the catalyst for that change. And as Lem sat outside his cabin, watching the sun set over the mountains, he knew that his work had created a lasting impact, a legacy that would continue to grow long after he was gone. His humble beginning had sparked a revolution in how people thought about survival. And in the end, that was all Lem had ever wanted, to make a difference. Years passed, and Lem's cabin remained a symbol of innovation and resilience in the valley. The harsh winters continued to test the men of the land, but Lem's design had endured, standing firm against every storm. The community had changed, now united by the shared knowledge of how to build structures that would last through generations. Lem watched it all with quiet satisfaction, though he remained as humble as ever. He hadn't built his cabin to become a legend. He had simply built it to survive. Yet in time, it had become something more, a symbol of what was possible when one combined hard work, innovation, and a willingness to push past convention. By the time Lem reached his late 50s, the land had changed again. More settlers had arrived, new families had established themselves, and the once small, struggling community had grown into a thriving hub of frontier life. Many of the cabins in the valley now mirrored Lem's design, each one carefully constructed to survive the long winters and harsh conditions of the mountains. His legacy was all around him, in the sturdy homes and in the way his neighbors spoke of him, always with respect, though few knew the full depth of what Lem had accomplished. He had never sought recognition, but he had earned it nonetheless. As Lem sat on the porch of his cabin one evening, looking out over the valley he had helped shape, he thought back on the years that had passed. There had been hardships, challenges, and moments of doubt, but through it all, he had persevered. The cold winters that once threatened his survival had now become a reminder of how far he had come. The storms no longer felt like enemies to be feared. They were simply a part of the land, something that could be met with patience and preparation. Lem had faced them head-on, building his cabin not just for himself but for those who would follow. In his later years, Lem's visits to his neighbors became less frequent. He was no longer the young man full of ambition and new ideas. But his cabin remained, a testament to his life's work, standing tall and strong against the mountains. His name was rarely spoken aloud, but it lingered in the valley, in the way people approached their work, in the respect they gave to the land. And that was enough for Lem. He had found peace in the quiet, knowing that his work had made a difference. By the time he passed away, Lem had lived a life that few could understand, one that had been shaped by the mountains, the wilderness, and the cabin he had built with his own hands. His legacy lived on in the valley, in every log cabin that withstood the seasons, and in the knowledge he had shared with the men and women of the land. He had built something that outlasted him. His story had become part of the land's story, and in the end, that was all anyone could hope for.